Good day. My name is Kim Moody, and I'm your host for In the Mood with Kim GC Moody podcast. And today we have a very special guest, and this is going to be, for tax geeks that I know some people follow, and we have the illustrious Kerry Harnish, and I'm going to get Kerry to explain who he is. But welcome, Kerry.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be on your podcast.
Yeah, real pleasure, Kerry.
We go back a few
It's
years.
we go back a few years, and I'm going to tell a story about that in a minute here, but. Just by way of broad background before we get going on who you are, why you're here. We've got your background, your Zoom background today on your new book, Bench Strength, and we'll talk about that. And that's one of the big reasons why I wanted to have you on and talk to you about your new landmark book on tax. And so we'll talk about that. But let's start off with who Kerry Harnish is. I first met you, Kerry. You were working for with the Department of Finance and the Tax Legislation Division, and very, very helpful. And I'll tell more of a story about that in a minute. But why don't we talk about who Kerry Harnish is and why tax practitioners should be interested. I know you're a humble guy, but who are you and what's your background? And you're a lawyer by background, I know that, but maybe talk about who you are and why you decided to go to law, and then I'll carry you
Sure.
from there.
Sure. Well, I'm from, I would say, both rural and urban Nova Scotia.
Nova
Um,
Scotia, I would have never
yeah,
guessed from your accent.
Maritimer. I'm a Maritimer. The um, I'm from an area of Nova Scotia that's called Hubbards. That's a general area, and the area is partially in Halifax County and partially in Lunenburg County, and it's on St. Margaret's Bay, which when I was a kid was a major fishing area. And my father was a fisherman, a
Oh,
stevedore,
wow.
and also a handyman. But he died when I was 14.
Oh,
My mother worked for many years in the food service section at the Victoria General Hospital in Halifax. My father wasn't very well at some point, and the decision was made that during the school year, I would spend that period of time with my grandparents in Halifax. And so I went to school in Halifax. So that's why I kind of I did start in the school system in Hubbards, but I mainly went to school in Halifax, and I lived with my grandparents. And I have fond memories of going to a school called St. Andrews, and where we lived was in the far west end of the peninsula of Halifax. And St. Andrews was a small school with great teachers, absolutely great teachers, and it had a very good sport program. And I went from there to Halifax West, and from Halifax West High School, which was a suburban high school as opposed to a city high school, but it was very close to where I lived, just off the west end of the peninsula. I went to St. Mary's on an academic scholarship in the South End. St. Mary's, if you're not from Atlantic Canada, St. Mary's probably has the largest accounting program in Atlantic Canada. It's a
oh,
commerce school. The commerce program is funded by the Sobeys, which is a national grocery
yeah,
chain.
yeah.
It's they're the funding for that school.
No,
The So I went to St. Mary's when I grew up, and the things that I did were mainly play hockey, swim on Queensland Beach in the South Shore in the summertime, and play fastball. I played a lot of hockey, a tremendous amount of hockey. I played in the Halifax system.
so you
And
must have watched last night's hockey game.
oh
We're
yeah, I
recording
watched.
this
Yeah, yeah,
because for people who are going to listen to this later, today is what is today? February 21st, 2025. Last night was the win by Canada over the US in the Four
yeah.
Nations. That was quite an exciting game. But
Yeah, I was
so,
talking to. I'm pretty close to my cousin, and we grew up together. And my cousin, who's down home right now, he lived for many years in Whistler, and he lives right now up in Nunavut, but he's home, and the games are starting. Like Ontario, it's okay. Out west is okay, but the games are starting like they don't get playing until 9:30 in Maritimes, and like
yeah.
10 o'clock in Newfoundland. Like it's hard to games. He was complaining about how late the bloody games are. You're only from Boston. Like Boston's fairly close to Halifax.
Well, especially it extends with overtime as well. So
Yeah,
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 I
yeah.
I think he's got some
So
justification. But let's keep going. You're
yeah,
so
so I ended up at St. Mary's, and I decided to go to law school, and so I
well. What
went.
triggered you for law school?
Well,
I'm
it's kind
I'm
of
always curious.
it's kind of looking back on it, I kind of set back, but the reason is I thought maybe at some point I might want to get into politics, and I
Oh,
thought,
really?
yeah, so that's what I thought, and I never did that. I came close a couple times, but I never did it, and so I went to the Dalhousie Law School, which is a very good law school in my
Yeah,
view,
it
and
is. Yeah.
it's the oldest it's the oldest law school in the Commonwealth, and I found it different from quite different from St. Mary's in the commerce program because and you'll understand this, when you're doing accounting and you're doing finance and you're doing even marketing, it's quantifiable.
Yeah.
It's quantifiable. It's not this moving opinions of various people who have their own opinions, and they dress their opinions up, and they make their argument about ideals and the law,
Right.
and these ideals about justice and all the rest. So I thought that was quite the change for me in an educational approach, because I was more a number type of person as opposed to these.
But just to be clear, Kerry, so did you take your commerce undergrad?
Yeah, I took
Oh,
it's commerce, accounting, quantitative
okay. For some
methods.
reason, I missed that. I mean,
No, no, no.
uh,
I'm not in that. I tell you though, in high school and junior high, what I really liked was history. I
oh, me too.
loved history, but I'm a working class guy. I'm not going to go off into history when where is that going to lead you?
Yeah.
So I was more practical and more in tune with what might be more of a career path, and I followed that career path through the commerce program at St. Mary's. So that's why I went to St.
Gotcha. And then you jumped
Mary's.
to law, of course, and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and uh and then what got you into tax, or was that a
Well,
journey itself, Kerry?
that's kind of a well, tax. Well, okay. What got me into tax, in a way, was law school.
Okay.
Because the law school had a couple very good tax professors. Well, I should say three. Its tax professors at the time were Professor Bala, Faye Woodman, and Ed Harris.
Oh,
And
Ed Harris. Yeah, the
and
illustrious
so
Ed Harris.
yeah, yeah. And so I but I didn't see a career path in tax, and so um, what I concentrated on in my last year was criminal law, believe it or
Oh,
not.
is that right?
Yeah, and so, but anyway, the variation to tax, it was kind of an evolution, because during the period that I was going to law school and after law school, my cousin and I had a small business in Halifax. We operate that for many years, and so um, at some point in towards the mid to late 80s. Um, we decided that we're going to pursue it any longer in Halifax, and that he was going to go west, and I was going to uh, do something else, and the law was part of that. And so one of the things I did was I was an adjunct lecturer of business law at St. Mary's University
Oh, okay.
in the late 1980s. I also decided to take an MBA part time at Dow, and at the same time, I decided to start working for the old Department of National Revenue in Halifax at the Ralston Building. So what came out of that was I ended up getting two stints at head office in Ottawa in the summer uh, at
With
National.
the Department of National Revenue?
Yeah, yeah, the old
Yeah,
Department of
okay.
National. So in the summer 1989, though, I decided to leave the Department of National Revenue. I was going to complete my MBA. So I decided to complete the MBA. What I was going to do after that, my plan was I was going to go to Toronto. And my plan was I was probably going to go to an accounting firm in Toronto. And what intervened was this opportunity to go to the Department of Finance. It came up very suddenly in late 1989. And I thought it over, and I said, yeah, I'm going to go to Ottawa for 3 or 4 years. And I'd been there 2 summers, two summers. But I didn't plan to stay. But I ended up doing that. My plan was to,
Well, you end
I
up
wanted to,
retiring there, didn't you?
yeah, yeah. My wife's from Ottawa. I ended up going to, I thought I was going to go either to Toronto or back home, Nova Scotia. And so here I am in Ottawa. Uh, I don't know, another
So,
maritime ruined in Upper Canada.
so 1989, I can't do math very well. That's a lot of years. That's
Yeah, yeah.
36
Well, I
years.
started in revenue before that. Yeah, so I probably worked almost 3 years at the old Department of National Revenue. I have to say this, that the old Department of National Revenue had an unbelievably good training program. And
I've heard that, yeah.
it was unbelievable. And the quality control that they had was really, really good on the audits and everything. And I experienced that training program. It was like really intense and it was really good. And
So,
I benefited from that.
well, without a doubt. So when you took the job with the Department of Finance, 1989,
No, I started in 90 because I finished my MBA. I started
99, okay.
June of 1990.
So maybe just explain, the average Canadian, I don't think truly understands that the Department of Finance is this big body. But
Yeah,
as and I've certainly dealt with the Department of Finance lots over my career, but the way I've conceptualized it, at least in my small brain, Kerry, is there's the political branch, which you see, that's the Minister of Finance and related staff, and then there's the people behind the scenes, people like you, and I that's
yeah,
and in tax, at least anyhow, that's the tax legislation division, which I think is where you're at.
yeah.
Not think, I mean, I know that's where you're at. Can you maybe just explain
Well,
what?
I was at.
Yeah, I know that.
So I started in 1990, and the way the Department of Finance is set up, it has various branches. It has an economic development branch, it has a financial institution branch, has a tax policy branch, and there are other branches. So
Right.
within the tax policy branch, there's several divisions. There would be a business income tax division,
Right.
mainly staffed with economists. Not all economists, but mainly staffed economists. There's a sales tax division, which is
Yep.
staffed by, and the sales tax division would handle not only sales tax but excise tax, the goods and services tax, tariffs and duties, which would be I would think is on the agenda right now.
I would think so.
The tax legislation division is mainly focused on income tax, but there are some odds and sods that it does occasionally. And when I started, I started in the personal, business, and property income group, and it was headed up by Jerry Lalonde at the time. And so
Oh yeah.
that's where I started. Now that group does the basic rules around business income, property income, personal income, deductions, all of that, the
Pretty broad.
capital cost allowance system,
Yeah.
tax shelters. There's a whole range of things that are in the SNR and ED incentives. There's a whole broad range, and it's kind of like foundational in a sense of what's in the Income Tax Act. There are all these other areas, but that's like a foundational area, and that's where I started. And
So
I remember coming in, and I got the office. So I come into Ottawa, and I go into the Department of Finance. I start, and well, whose office do I get? I get Tim Walk's office. I don't know if you know Tim, but Tim
no.
ended up
Oh,
Tim.
sorry. Yes. Yes. Yes.
So and I ended up inheriting Tim Walk's files. So that's where I was under Jerry Lawn, and Tim had some very interesting files, and I ended up inheriting them. He ended on going on, I think, to hit up Galling's tax group, if I remember
Yeah.
correctly.
Yeah.
I think he's retired now.
So what is a young punk, Carry, obviously very smart guy, has got some business experience. He's a maritimer, likes hockey, moves to Ottawa, and now all of a sudden he's in, the tax legislation division and business income property. You go into Tim Walk's office, what is some of the stuff you're working on? Because, for tax practitioners and just the average Canadian, you know, we often wonder, I'll speak for myself as a youngster, I thought, what the hell do these guys do every day? It's not like they're working on clients.
The
So,
thing, so you can bear in mind, I'm new, I'm green, and under Jerry, and Jerry has his own history and his background. He's very knowledgeable, and so I'm starting out slow, and in the sense that I'm doing technical issues that are coming up. I can remember a few technical issues. It would take probably 2 to 3 years before I would be I was handed a major file to kind of.
Now, when you say a major file, just on that, Kerry, what does that mean? Is it things that, Canadians let the Department of Finance know, or practitioners
These
know
are
that,
things
hey,
that come out. Yeah, these I don't. We'd be going down a bit of a rabbit hole, but the first major file that I got, which would be very well, would be remembered in Western Canada for sure, was the National Income Stabilization Account. And so that had a whole series of tax measures that had to be done with it to actually integrate that
the
program.
so-called NISA, if I
Yeah,
recall?
the NISA, the
Yeah,
old NISA accounts. And so that
yeah,
was
I
the
remember
first. And
that.
so that means I have to, like, I'm involved in all the discussions of, with the farm groups and the Department of Agriculture. And the minister at the time, it had been Michael Wilson, then it moved to become Don Mazankowski. So that file that was probably the first major file I worked on. But what really kind of came along was something that kind of consumed about 3 years or more of my time at finance. And what it was very aggressive tax shelters that fell into our area. And there's a whole series of tax shelter measures that were pushed out at that time under Prime Minister Paul Martin's tenure at Department of Finance as the minister. And so, I mean, the matchable expenditure rules, the
Yeah.
limited recourse debt rules, there is a series of rules all around that. And so that's kind of, I was kind of doing tax shelters for, 3 4 years. And there was announcements and rules, press releases. One of the things that popped up in the middle of all that, which was a major file, was and you may remember this, it was the 1995 fiscal period rules for individuals running
Oh, yeah.
proprietorships and partnerships.
Yeah.
That
Where
was
the
that was
diff
probably the second hottest file I ever handled.
So that was
Is the
you.
lead. That was like a very hot file. If I remember correctly, it was I'd say the 1995 budget.
Yeah,
Minister
I think you're right.
Martin, that Minister Martin was at the lead in the forefront of shutting down the out of control spending and deficit finance that was going on. And I think, if I remember correctly, if you kind of go through the old budget documents, I think the number one line item for revenue to kind of help to try to deal with this fiscal crisis was that measure. There was
Yeah.
it was big. There was a big numbers in that budget document. I think it was the number one line item. And
Yeah,
so
well, I remember that like it was yesterday because I was a youngster and, getting into tax, and all of a sudden these rules are foisted on us, and it's like, holy cow, these are complicated.
yeah, oh, they're
Yeah.
complicated. Yeah, nowhere near as complicated as what came out several years later, which was the corporate side of it. Like there was the individual side, but there's also the corporate. And I ended up doing that towards the end of my career at finance. But within all of that came a really really interesting file that it came under the tax shelter file, and it was right in the middle of all that. So what it was the Canadian film and video tax credit regime, refundable.
Oh, yeah.
So I ended up doing that one as because the decision had been made at some point that the old film tax credit, the film tax shelter regime that was for Canadian films, Canadian content films, would be ended. So that kind of took me straight through most of my time in that group. By 2000, I moved to the corporate reorganization group, domestic corps and whatever. But I still got asked to deal with or handle, I should say, some files that were significant, and two of them you'll remember. They weren't domestic corp or corporate reorg files, but two of them, and one of them was probably there was a lot of feedback on it. It was third party civil penalties.
Oh, yeah. I
So
was involved in that.
that I had the lead on that, and the other one, which was a lot of feedback, was on the one I think we met over
Yeah, I think
met
so.
on, which is restrictive covenants. And for viewers that don't know, Kim has up on his as his firm's website, he has a paper And
Yeah.
and in the paper, in the title of the paper is quote unquote brain overload.
Yep.
Brain over,
Thanks for
absolutely brain overload.
that. So let's talk
This
about
is
that for a
something the
second.
average viewer does not want to look at.
No, let's talk about that. But before I do, because I want to talk about how we met and just your role more and ultimately your book here that we're going to talk about. But
Yeah.
tell me, I mean, you've already mentioned some of the political ministers that you've
Oh yeah, yeah.
answered to. But so if I understand the role correctly, I mean, you're a bureaucrat. You're out there drafting legislation and giving advice on issues and potential solutions and ultimately you're drafting it using your legal skills
Yeah.
and working with the team. But I think the average Canadian thinks that the Department of Finance, the one that you worked in, the tax legislation division, is a massive division.
No, it's not.
And and I
It's not even a large department. It's one of the smallest departments in the government of Canada. At least when I was
bingo.
there, like it's a very
And
small.
that surprised me, right? That when I
Yeah.
first started working with people like you in the department, I thought, what? It's only that big? So tell the
Well,
viewers
when I
how big
left,
it
I'll tell
is.
you. So when I left, so that'd be 2019. So in the tax legislation division, I would say there were somewhere between 25 and 30 officers. Uh, Now, the tax legislation division concentrated on income tax. It didn't
Yeah,
contact
yeah,
BST, but so there's
yeah.
25 to 30 officers in that division. Not all of them doing legislation because there's people. They'd be chief, now they call them directors that have a team in these particular areas like business or corporate, and then within that team you'd have a legislative review committee, and all the draft legislation had to go to a legislative review committee, and there's usually a co-chairman from the legislation division and also from the Department of Justice's
Yeah,
legal services
makes
group.
sense.
And when I started, the person who was on the committee was in effect, let's say, running the committee was Al Short, kind of a
I
legend.
remember. Yeah,
And so he was the person when I started, and Al was an accountant. He was not a lawyer.
yeah.
And when I left, it was Trevor McGowan, and in between it included Jerry Lawn and Ted Cook, and Ted Cook's now a tax court justice. And
I
so
saw that, which is awesome.
yeah, so the the group is relatively small,
So
and
how many did I hear you say? About
when I left,
25-ish?
it wouldn't have been when I started, but when I left, it was let's say 28, somewhere between 25 and 30.
Okay, so let's
It would have
put that
been
in
smaller when
perspective.
I started.
Let's put that in perspective for a second, Kerry. I mean, the CRA, the Canada Revenue Agency, which of course has had its name changes over the years, but they're the administrator of the law, right? And they've got a very,
Audits,
very,
the whole
yeah, they've got
ruling.
all, yeah, they've got a big, big mandate. But ultimately, they're administering the law that you and your colleagues at the tax legislation division, at least in income tax,
Yeah,
were administering. Or sorry, we're creating. That's what I meant to say.
drafting. Yeah, yeah. So
So, so
where does
today
that
we
law
have,
come from? Like, where do the ideas for that law come from? And so, I don't know, maybe your viewers would be interested in this. The ideas come from several places. Um, like, of
I want to come
course,
back to my point in a second, but I want to hear this. So go ahead.
but the first place, obviously, and a very important place, is the government and its Minister of Finance. The government has its own
Yeah.
agenda. It'll have an
Political agenda.
agenda on
Yeah.
all these different things, and that's a very important uh, consideration of what's going to happen
Yep.
over the mandate of a government. In addition to that, though, um, you have you have the CRA. These issues pop up on audit and whatever. You also have the court decisions. Any officer that's
Right.
properly doing his job is following the court decisions, because there will be adverse decisions that have implications for how things are efficient, how efficient things are in the income tax system. In
Yeah.
addition to that, you have other departments. You have provincial governments who have issues. You have tax practitioners, tax
Yeah.
professionals, and their groups, like the Joint Committee, which is
Yeah.
a group of the Canadian Bar Association and the Professional Accountants Association. They have
Yeah.
a
I was a co-chair of that. Kerry, as you probably
and
know.
and they have their own views and ideas and suggestions. In addition, you have lobby groups. There's all
Right.
kinds of lobby groups, and in addition to all that, you have the average taxpayer. I mean, average taxpayers will, they will have some, very difficult issues that pop up, and some of those end up being resulting changes in the law.
Yeah, which I think is interesting, and I've written on terms of how tax policy should be developed in the future. I think there's a better way, and but with that issue aside, let's go back to a second to my premise. Today we've got a little over 50,000 CRA employees, and we've
Yeah.
got, call it 30 people that are drafting the
Oh, I
law, at
think it's
least in
bigger
income
than that.
tax.
I think it's probably grown. I think
Okay,
it's.
well,
I'd
okay,
say it's
but how much
probably.
would it have grown by? Let's say it's 50. Do you
Oh,
think
I
it's
would
more than
say
50?
50%. Oh, would it be more than 50? I don't know. I'm not sure. For some, maybe 50, maybe 40 to 50, I would think.
But my point being, and I'm not asking for you to, because this can get a little political, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot here, but I've always been stunned that key people like yourself, and because I know some of the people that are in the Department of Finance Tax Legislation Division, and they're phenomenal talents. And frankly, Canada's lucky to have them there, that talent. But such a small group. I'm not saying that we should have 50,000 people drafting tax legislation, but should we have more than 50?
I don't feel comfortable commenting on that. The
No, I
government,
know you
the
don't, but
Department of Finance makes its decisions on how many people it's going to have, and I would add a factor to that. I think, and I think most listeners would understand this, that experience and knowledge about whatever you're working on isn't at the time you start your career, wherever it is.
no, of
It's
course not.
accumulated over time.
Yeah.
It's the issues that pop up. It's how you make mistakes. You try to adjust to correct for those mistakes. All those things, factors goes in, and I think what's happened is I think a lot of the knowledge may have left the Department of Finance.
Well,
Um,
that's my big issue,
and
Kerry, right?
so I think that's uh,
It's an issue.
that's an important component of what is an efficient operation.
I agree. And so again, without going out too much of a rabbit hole, I mean, you and I know a lot of the same people. I don't really want to mention names, but when I first started practicing years and years ago, the people that were at the Department of Finance and in charge of the tax legislation division, would have been your bosses.
Yeah.
And some of these people were just phenomenal talents, and it's gone. And with such a
Well,
small group
it
of
will be
people,
replaced. It will be replaced. But I think one of the parts of what's happened here is we got this baby boomer generation, which I'm a member of, and it
yeah,
kind of came through. It came through like a python, something going through it into a python, and it came through. And when it exited in a relatively short time period. And that
yeah,
kind of created a vacuum where you have younger people, and normally what happened if everything would be efficient, the ease out would be relatively slow. So the managements that come in are those new, more experienced people, and everything goes smoothly. But in life, things don't go smoothly. And so I think what I believe that the tax legislation division has incredibly talented people, but I think
I
also
agree.
I think also that a lot of the experience has gone out, and it's going to take time. And the only way, unfortunately, that if sometimes you can learn is through the mistakes that happen.
I think that's like anything in life. You learn from your mistakes. I think Thomas Edison said, you know,
How many
when
times you
how many times he's failed, he goes, I know that what's the quote? I put it in my newsletter last week. I now know 1,000 things that don't work.
yeah, and one that does,
Which
I got a light bulb.
exactly, exactly. There's a lot of wisdom in that, right?
Yeah,
But I've always worried that when you have such a small group, call it 30, call it 50, whatever the number is, the Canada is susceptible to that knowledge leaving. And so,
yeah,
and it's like any succession plan for a business, right? where is that succession plan? So anyhow, I know we're going down a
Uh,
rabbit hole.
yeah,
Let's let's
yeah.
let,
Um,
let's move on because I want to get to your book here. And but before we do, I'll tell you how I first met you, and you kind of already hinted about it. The restrictive covenant rules, section
restricted government.
56.4. I remember when those proposals came out, and they were designed to try and, hate using the word loophole, but to patch a loophole in terms of how restrictive covenant proceeds were taxed because people were taking advantage of it. It was becoming a bit of a tax product, and government of Canada was not amused with some case law, and because there were some adverse decisions, using your
Yeah,
phrase.
man,
And
if I
so,
remember correctly, in 14. But
so
that whole background to that is there's an interesting angle to that that I'm not sure. Like I'm going back, what, a couple
20
decades
years.
now, so I could get
Yeah,
some facts off here. But my recollection of this, and not the case law, but my recollection of this is that when I initially started researching the matter, I learned that the issue of the taxation of restrictive covenants had reached the United States Supreme Court in the
yeah,
1960s. And that so under its approach to taxation legislation and interpreting it, they take a business substance over legal form approach,
yeah,
and it came out that it was taxable. It was ordinary income. Okay, so it's the same issue comes up in Canada. I don't know what, by the late 90s, so let's say 3 decades later.
yeah,
And so if on reversal so it was on reversal in Manrell, the Federal Court of Appeal ruled that it wasn't taxable. So we
yeah,
don't have to get into the details of it, but we have two judicial systems in North America reaching opposite results on a very similar issue. One, it's ordinary income. One, it's a tax nothing. Um, and and so, well, what comes out? Well, one of the differences between the two systems is the approach that the judiciary takes to taxation and interpreting the legislation. And bench
yeah.
strength, in a way, is about that. So in
Right.
Canada, we end up with this non-taxability of restricted. Well, of course, that results in a lot of tax planning, and so the rules came out, and it was the original, and the minister was John Manley at the time, and the press release that I recall coming out, um, it didn't have detailed draft legislation
Oh,
in it. It
didn't.
had a backgrounder in it, and the
Yeah,
backgrounder explained the issue, what the proposal was going to be, to ensure that there was taxability here. Well, no sooner does that go out, and now I'm keeping an eye on what's in the tax literature, and because you gotta, how can you not keep an eye
so
on
is that
what's
how you
going
came
on in the
across
tax?
my name?
No, I didn't come across your name. There was somebody else writing an article on the restricted covenant uh, uh, press release, let's call it, and I won't get into the details, but the implication of it was that, oh, guess what? If that's what they do, um, well, we can shift the value to other clauses in a contract. It doesn't have to be restricted
uh,
covenant. And
yeah.
that kind of that revelation that could happen turned everything into what ended up being brain overload.
Which is
Because
the
we didn't
title of
want to
my
have a
paper.
repeat. We didn't want to have a repeat.
Yeah, which sometimes practitioners should just shut their mouth. No, I'm just kidding.
Or maybe we could fix the interpretive approach being taken by the Supreme Court of Canada.
Yeah, let's not go down that.
That's what the book's
Well,
about.
actually,
That's
yeah,
the book's
well,
about.
uh, uh, so we'll talk about that. So
Yeah.
just to finish up the story, these proposals on restrictive covenant came out, and then I think it was 2008, if I recall. So 17 years ago, I thought, I better take a run at this, and so
Oh
CTF
yeah.
asked me to write a paper, and I was very, very confused by the draft legislation that was released. And so I saw your name in some of the stuff, and I thought, I'm gonna pick up the phone and call this guy. And I'd never met you then, and you were
I
gracious
didn't know
enough
who
to
you
answer the
were.
phone. Yeah.
Just another guy phoning.
Yeah. And so I don't know if you remember this because I'm sure you got calls like crazy,
Oh,
but
I get a lot of calls. Yeah.
yeah. But as I've said many times over the years, you were very gracious. You spent a lot of time with me to help me understand the rules. And then I wrote the paper. I was critical of the
Mhm.
rules, mainly because of the complexity. Now
Yeah.
I understand I understand it. And that's a helpful historical footnote in terms of why the rules decided to do that, like shift other clauses. I get that. And if tax practitioners want to take a look at section 56.4, you'll see that's got Kerry stuff all over it. But
Look, section 68, that's where the shift have to right into section 68.
yeah, 68, that's
Just a
right.
number to people, but it's an important section in the context of this.
That's right. Yeah. And so I ended up writing this paper. I was a little uncomfortable because it was so bloody complicated. And I ended up, delivering it in Calgary at the time. And who's front row? Kerry Harnish.
Yeah.
And Kerry, I'd never met you before, so I didn't know, but you came up and graciously introduced yourself. And I don't know if you remember this, but you are very complimentary. And you said, and by the way, in typical Kerry style, you might want to think about this as well. And I thought, oh man, why didn't I think of that? So anyhow, that was my introduction to Kerry Harnish, and so and I've always, over the years been very, very respectful. At least I hope I have been here because I
Well,
do.
absolutely. I mean,
And, you know,
we might not agree on things
no, of course we
in
don't.
taxation,
But
but I think we're very respectful of each other. And like, that's what we need more of in Canada. Like a lot of
totally,
respect between people.
absolutely. And I've always said,
People have their own views. And I think what it gets lost in all this is there's a lot of truth in the views of, let's say, people on the left and people on the right, and they get lost in their own views and not realize, hey,
totally.
there's some truth here on either side. I'm more in the middle.
Me too.
That's where
That's the way
I'm
I
in the
view
middle.
myself. I view myself in the middle, but I know that
Yeah,
I get characterized as being very on the right. But that's topic
yeah,
for another day. Let's talk about. So you retired from the Department of Finance 2019, and you still got lots of piss and vinegar in yourself, and it's some historical knowledge as we've
what
talked
the
about.
heck happens?
And we talked about history and knowledge, and
Yeah,
and I get a note from you one day about how you're writing a book, which is,
yes. How did
your
that come
background
about?
behind you. So talk about what is bench strength and,
Yeah,
what's the
ben,
background behind that?
I mean, what bench strength is about, it's about the evolution in the Supreme Court of Canada's approach to income tax and income tax avoidance from 1920 to 2019. That's the kind of the approach.
Sorry, 1920 to
1920 to 2019 is what I meant to say.
2019. Okay. Yeah.
So it's like a century, covering a century of income tax decisions. And in the book, what I do is I identify who I think are the nine most important income tax judges
Yeah.
from the Supreme Court of Canada perspective in income over the arc of that 100 years. Now, that's my like an all-star bench of judges. I divided the bench between at 1982 because that's the year the charter was enacted, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And I think that's an important milestone in what's going on in the case law. I'll come back to that in a minute. And so I have four judges from the pre-charter era and four judges from I call it the charter era. And then the Chief Justice that I selected is Chief Justice Brian Dixon, whose tenure at the Supreme Court spanned the two eras. He's from Manitoba. He spanned the two eras. So one of the things I didn't mention when I mentioned when I went to, when we discussed about me going to law school is the class. I was in the class in 1982, and there's a very interesting tidbit about the class of 1982. It's the last class that was to graduate before the enactment of the charter. So the
Yeah.
charter came April 17th, 1982, but that's the last class. And in the lead up to that enactment, um, there was many discussions, and it was I would say it was controversial whether or not there should be a charter enacted, and all of that in our classes. I had a great constitutional law professor, Wayne McKay, and it was dynamics. Everything, and there was litigation going on. Would there be a charter and all of this? And so it was a momentous time to be, and a very exciting time to be in law school, and all these discussions going on. And I would say one thing about, just as I come out of that, there would be no charter without the notwithstanding clause. So I just kind of throw that out because a lot of people don't want to hear that, but I just
Yeah.
want to say that. Secondly, I the income tax law that I studied was this older law, pre-charter law, because it's all pre-charter law.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that's important to know, because the timeline is I'm coming out of law school before there's a charter under the old law, and then the charter is going to do a flip on what the law might be in certain areas. And so that's relevant to know. So by the 1990s, I kind of thought there was something going on in the Supreme Court of Canada that was moving the approach to interpreting income tax law in a direction that not only did I disagree with, but I kind of thought there's something going on here that I don't really understand, because it's completely inconsistent with what I studied, back in the 70s and early 80s. And so I didn't really do much about that, but it was just a thought in my mind. And then these cases started coming out, and I decided to write an article on statutory interpretation, which was published in the Alberta Law Review in
Yeah.
1997. And so I put my marker on what I thought it should be. And I mentioned that I think it's the preface of the book. And so I'm working. I'm busy, man. At work, I got like all these files going on. So I just kind of walk away from that whole discussion, let it work out. And anybody thinks my views are right or wrong, let them do it. And but what flipped the switch for me was the Canada Trust Code decision 2005. For those who don't know, it's the first decision under the GAR. It was the taxpayer was successful in it. I wrote a long piece on the Canada Trust Code, and I won't go into the details because it's an incredibly complex case. The tax place it's like brain overload 2 or 4. And so I remember reading the hard copy of the decision, and I thought, oh, I'm astonished by this. So I walk up the hall, and I go see my manager at the department, who's Devine Roach, who we had a long discussion about it. And her view was, and I agreed with her view, that these seminal decisions in tax are really you got to know the culture of the times. You have the background of the judges, what their life experiences were, and it's not as simple as looking at precedent. Yeah, that's the first thing. And in law school, you're told precedent is what's supposed to be followed. So bear that.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So then I go over, and this is where kind of things go off the rails, and I end up in a rabbit hole. Is I on the way back to my office, there's Daryl Boychuk. Now Daryl's from Saskatchewan. Practiced in
I know
Calgary
Daryl
for several years at Fulesky Flynn and another firm.
Great firms that he was at.
I go, hey Daryl, and Daryl, I play hockey together. Okay, so we played hockey together a long time. So I go, hey Daryl, this Canada, and I start talking to him about the case, and I'm talking about a conversation with Devine, and he goes, well, Kerry gets there, prove it. And so oh man, prove it. Okay, how do you do that? And
right.
So
that was the inspiration.
And that was the inspiration. And so I don't know if your listeners would be interested, but so how do you even tackle such a subject when you think that there's something off, but you don't understand what it is, and like how do you even approach that situation? And because I would say I don't know of any, all of the academic and tax professional and judicial approach to the statutory interpretation of tax law in Canada goes down the lane that the Duke of Westminster principle from 1935, which is a British decision, provides the basic approach to interpreting statutory law when you're dealing with tax avoidance. And in addition to that Supreme Court followed that approach.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the only way to even attempt to kind of figure out what's going on, the very first step I decided was, okay, I have to go back in time, and I have to read. I'm sorry about that. I have to go back in time and read all of the decisions of the Supreme Court of Canada in their chronological order. I have to identify them and read them. And the identification sounds like it would be easy. It's not as easy as you'd think, because some of these decisions were oral dismissals from the bench. And, people think that an oral dismissal from the bench is an unimportant decision. That's not true. And so it took me you know, to read all those decisions, there was 399 that I identified, plus all the lower court decisions. To read all that took a long time. And
Did
so
you do this like throughout your career or after you
no, I did
retired?
it over years. I'm doing it. One of the things I say in the book, to even attempt this, like I my main hobby is playing hockey. It's not doing this sort of thing.
It's
So
not.
I was playing hockey 3 to 5 times a week, winter and summer. I have a whole series of friends that I play hockey with, from all walks of life. And we had a very good team, Tenants Pump. It was a bar in downtown Ottawa. And they sponsored us. We even have the Molson rep on the team, who's a good player too. And so that's what I
Jeez.
did. And so I said,
Tax
oh
guys
man,
that play
if I'm going
hockey
to go
and
down
drink
this
beer.
rabbit hole, I can't play hockey 3 to 5 times a week anymore. So I kind of said, okay, I'm going to do it. So and then I put on weight because I don't play hockey 3 to 5 times a week anymore. So I read all the decisions over time. That became my hobby. Okay, I'm going to read these decisions, try to make sense of them. So after I read them, I starting to get a feel for them, and then I said, well, okay, I'm going to go further this. I got to go I got to put this all in context. So I got to start reading historical books, books on the judges, historical books, and so I expanded out and I love libraries. I just love libraries. And I go in and I start looking at the books, the historical books of all these ministers of that connect to a minister of finance or connect to one of the Supreme Court judges that I'm looking
Right.
at, and I'm reading and looking for information just to try to gather it all up. And then I'm kind of like something kind of came at me, which you kind of don't think is going to happen because you got the narrative out there, the Duke of Westminster, the Duke of Westminster. But I kind of go, well, wait a sec. Supreme Court, the only time it ever talks about the decision in a majority decision, it distinguished the decision, 1938, the very first case I opened the book with that I analyzed, Pioneer Laundry. So in effect, they say it's not applicable under the old Income War Tax Act because it's the wording of that statute is different from the British statutes. So this principle does not apply, but it gets overturned 1939 by the British Privy Council, which is the historic right of citizens in the British Empire to take leave of a lower court decision from the Dominions to England and have the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council decide the dispute. They overturn, they apply the Duke of Westminster, but that's distinguished. I can't find it ever being applied in a majority income tax decision prior to the charter. I go, whoa, what's going on here? And so that becomes, oh, this is interesting because does the charter have an effect here? Because they're not applying it, and what they're doing is they're not citing it, they're not distinguishing it, they're just ignoring it. And what's that
Well,
about? I think it's North America, the culture in North America, and what's going on through the 30s, 40s, and 50s is completely different from what's the culture is in the United Kingdom. And we're becoming influenced by the Americans and the American approach. And the American approach is the opposite of the Duke of Westminster approach. It's the Gregory decision, also from 1935. So the United Kingdom's judiciary and the American judiciary went off in different versions, different lanes, if you will, or different rivers. And the Canadian approach, it doesn't say it's anything about the American approach, but it's consistent with the American approach, not consistent with the British approach. And that was like a revelation to me when I realized that. And so then that's the first part of the book. It goes through the old judges. They're all deceased now, and their decisions. And it's like trying to see the forest for the trees.
right.
They're very hard to kind of figure it all out. And anybody reading the book, you'll see a bunch of trees and you can't see the forest if you start, there's just a tree sort of thing. But eventually the forest comes together and it flips after the charter and everything goes off in a different direction. And some stats for somebody that because I did some manual stats, like I took quantitative methods in St. Mary's and also in the MBA. So I did some basic stats, and the stats were like, ooh, pre-charter, and I also did a database to categorize the cases that I thought were tax avoidance cases. And and what I came up with manual, this is manual counts. I had 83% of the decisions in a tax avoidance case before the charter were for the Crown. What's interesting, also interesting about that, these judges are very conservative judges. They're not liberal judges. And what I mean by that, their approach to the law, they let the law evolve over time. They don't make major moves, and they don't create broad principles where the
Right.
liberal judges will make sharp interventions into the law where they think it's warranted, and they'll put in a broad principles. So these old conservative judges, they're not. But so I think, what's that about? Well, my uncle, kind of putting it to practical things. My uncle had served in the Canadian Army, Nova Scotia Highlanders during the Second World War, and my other uncle had served in Korea in the Canadian Army. And my uncle, who served in after the D-Day landings in Europe, he lost his leg in the Second World War,
Oh
and
boy.
and so I think I think what's going on, and Justice Brian Dixon, he lost his leg in the Second World War in the
Oh, I
general
didn't know
area
that.
where my uncle was actually inside Germany, so it's not quite the general area, but he lost it also after the D-Day landings. I'm thinking back on this, and I'm thinking, these are all I'm gonna call small conceit conservative people. I don't want to speak for Justice Dixon, but I'm talking about my family. And well, if you can, generally working class. And so I'm thinking, okay, I think what's going on here, to some extent, is cultural. This is about people who served in the Second World War, the wars, experienced the Great Depression, the hardship years. And I think what might be going on here is that they don't like tax avoidance. And they did their duty, if you want to put it one way, and they don't like seeing others not paying whatever the amount is that's fair, what people think might be a fair share. So I think these older conservative judges are denying tax avoidance. And
Interesting.
I think that's what's going on. And the judicial approach that they take to do this is very interesting in my view. It's commercial substance trumps legal form,
Yeah. Which of course
which is
now
the
is
opposite of what it is now after the charter. And
right.
and when they do that, they're looking at commercial principles, and they're saying these commercial principles are just as relevant and just as important. And while there might be a literal or strict approach to interpreting the law in the Duke of Westminster principle, that that doesn't apply where the commercial substance of something, if you were to allow it, would not respect the object and spirit of the law. We're going to put the law in its context, in its purpose, in these statutory provisions, and we'll look at the text. But the text is not just the only thing you look at. You look at the context in which that text exists and its purpose. And what comes out of that is all these reversals and all these decisions that say, no, the tax avoidance is not going to be allowed. And this, of course, is also during a period that there's a great economic boom in Canada after the Second World War.
Right.
The
Yeah.
economy takes off. The working class, many of them move into the middle class, or certainly the lower middle class. All opportunities open up for the baby boomer generation. And the baby boomer generation, which is or the generation that I'm in, they didn't experience the hardships that their parents and their grandparents. So they kind of lost touch with that hard reality. I think we're going back to that hard reality. I think that's where we're going. That's where we're headed
Yeah.
in Canada. And that's very unfortunate and very concerning economically, socially, and everything. But anyway, we'll move on.
Yeah. Well, we're bumping up against the time here, Kerry. I can't believe it. But let me.
How long have we
So
been on? I'm just talking here. How long have we gone?
it's approaching an hour. So
You're kidding me. Oh my gosh.
yeah.
Okay, let's
So
get
I
going.
mean,
Sorry about that.
your passion is showing, which I love it. But you had the uh, you gave me an advanced copy of your book,
Yeah,
which, by the way, is it released yet, or when's the release
it's
date?
it's it's the 25th, February 25th.
February 25th. Okay, so we're
That's the
4 days
that's
away.
yeah,
So, um, so I read the book. I need to read it again.
yeah. It's a lot in
But
it, a lot in it.
it there's a lot in it. But when I finished it, I sent you a note, and thank you for putting my quote in your book. But um, I was just blown away with the history, because like
Yeah,
you, I love history.
yeah.
There's lots to
So
learn
much to
from
learn
history.
in history.
Oh God, I love it. I minored, not formally, but in
Yeah,
Canadian history, post-Confederation. So of course, your historical analysis on a topic, tax, and Supreme Court yeah, decisions, is just fascinating. And so, long story short is, I think that your book is a must read for any tax practitioner in Canada.
yeah.
So I, you know, commend you for that. Um,
Thank you.
I've been practicing tax for 30 years, and there's a ton in your book that I just had no idea about. And so I'm a better tax practitioner, frankly, a better tax historian, for having read your book, which I will read again. But for the average listener here, Kerry, in two
The
minutes or
non-tax
less,
professional, let's say the non-tax professional.
yeah, say the non-tax. I mean, first of all, would the average Canadian be interested in your book? But
Well, let me say, I hope so. Um, but of course, it's got that legal stuff in it, and
yeah,
the average Canadian, their eyes might glaze over to some. But let me pull back.
like tax, right?
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah. But if they like tax, I think yes. Or if they really want to understand what's going on inside the Supreme Court of Canada with respect to its approach to income tax and tax avoidance, I think reading the book would help them. But let me say this for you and tax practitioners that are and students, tax students that will read the book. I would say start from the front and go to the cover. Go from the front to the back. Just kind of read it
right,
as you read the tree,
it's
see
like a
the
story.
forest, just as a narrative. But the
Yeah, I
non-tax
agree.
professional, I think that that approach, it becomes hard to see um, the forest, if you will, because of the law that's kind of part of this. So what I would say on that for those people, I say read Brian Arnold's forward, read the preface because the preface will explain how I went down this rabbit hole, and read the introduction because the introduction will give you the outline of what the book is about. Once you've done that, skip to the conclusion and the epilogue. The conclusion will give you a summary of the book, of what's the narrative. It'll give you the summary of the narrative. And I start getting more of my views in the conclusion, and then the epilogue, which tries to bring the story up forward from 2019, 2021, that period. And the epilogue is probably a little more political. David Sherman certainly said that he thought it was more politically and politically oriented. And once you've done that, this average reader that's not a tax professional, then go back and start at the cases and recognize that they're one tree in a forest, but now you'll have an understanding where the narrative is going. And the way I tried to make the cases interesting, because on several of the cases I tried it what I tried to pull out the Canadian history that's around it, the characters, the politicians, the taxpayers, the economic events, and the political events that are surrounding these cases that make them, and the dynamics between the people involved, whether the judges, the politicians, because there's dynamics that are involved that people don't know about. And I got that information from just looking at the historical record that's not tax.
Yeah, and I have to say, Kerry, just sorry to cut you off, but we are running out of time here. But uh, that's what I found fascinating. Besides, the history lesson, and just the weaving, and looking for the pattern, like you're one tree in a forest, as you say. I found it fascinating that you dove into the humanness of the judges, which
Yeah,
ultimately, as you've said, the time, the culture, the you know,
that's the
ju-
point Devine made, and that's the point Devine made. This You got to know who these
yeah.
people are. You just have to know,
And
and
I think
it's knowing your judge.
yeah, and I think the average human being, try that again, the average Canadian who doesn't understand the function of law, and
Yeah,
how law works,
the ideas, they're elusive, man. The ideals are very elusive.
Yeah,
It takes a lot for 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 people, average people, and even not so average people, to keep those ideals moving forward in a consistent, reasonable way.
yeah. Well,
It takes a lot.
I
That's detail. That's detail. And detail is, there's a lot of people don't want to deal with detail, but that's detail. And you got to try to keep things on the rails. There's going to be inefficiencies, but in an efficient manner that moves things forward in a way that there's a general consensus that this is being done right.
yeah. Well, I think this book that you've I mean, first of all, I commend you, Kerry. I mean, when I read it, it was like, holy geez. I mean, I wrote this little book here, right?
Yeah,
It's a breezy read. It, it's not it's not anywhere near what you wrote, and I commend you for doing it. I think
yeah,
Canada is better for having such a well researched and you mentioned David Sherman, who is one
yeah,
of
yeah, yeah.
Canada's
Top
you know
tax authors,
oh
absolutely
he's
amazing,
amazing,
amazing. Yeah,
amazing fellow,
one
and
of the average reader.
you've got
Very
the quote
absolutely.
behind you. You got to move your head a little bit here, but Kerry Harnish has produced a thoughtful and thoroughly researched tour de force on the history of the judgments of the Supreme Court of Canada on tax issues. Although I've been studying and writing about tax law for 45 years, I still learned a lot from the book. And that's a quote from David Sherman.
Yeah,
And
sure.
and and that was exactly how when I read the book, I thought, geez, I thought I knew a lot, which was humbling, right? Because as a tax practitioner, you can't know everything. As a
Yeah.
tax academic, as a tax, department of, you can't know everything. But Carrie, I do commend you for this. It's extremely well researched and well done.
Yeah.
So on a closing note, where
Yeah.
do people find your book?
Well,
Ian?
next week. Hopefully, it'll be available at the local bookstore, but also it's going to be, or it is available for pre-order at retailers online, including Amazon, Indigo, probably your local retailer like McNally, or Down Home in Nova Scotia. There's retailers on the streets, and it's also available at Sutherland Host Experts, who's the publisher,
Okay.
at their website. And so the price is 38.95 Canadian. And so
Are you going to get rich from this, Carrie?
I doubt it. I think we'll see. I'm not going to get rich. I can tell you that. I would, I don't know. I don't know but what, like Kim, what do you think the market for this is? It's, I,
I think it's a
we'll see.
niche
We'll
market.
see. We'll see.
I think it's a niche market, but it's a damn
Yeah.
important market, right?
Yeah.
And I commend you again. And maybe one final comment from you, because of your long history of the Department of Finance and my excellent interactions with you over the years. For youngsters that are thinking about getting into tax, is the Department of Finance Tax Legislation Division a good place to be?
I would think so. Yes, absolutely. I would say so. It would be a great place to get, experience over the long term or over even a 3 or 4 year stint. The issues are incredibly interesting, fascinating, and you're always doing something that you think, oh, this is you're doing. If you're into tax like you are, Kim, you're doing something that is so stimulating of your mind, and it's important work, very important work. Getting the tax system right is not easy, but so much depends upon the economy, our economic efficiencies, whether or not the correct amount of revenues are being made, and how those revenues are ultimately spent is
Yeah.
beyond the tax system. But the tax system is incredibly important for financing our democracy in our Canada, and we want that to be better. And so the better the tax system is, the better the country hopefully can be. Hopefully a lot of attention and commitment will be paid to things that are not going so well right now. And I think the tax system is not in a good place right now, the income tax system. And hopefully, maybe this book is part of putting it in a better place. Because
Well,
ultimately, I haven't said this. Ultimately, I think what the difficulty is, and I want to say this, is with the approach to tax avoidance, is that I think the taxes are being shifted to average working class Canadians and middle class Canadians, from those who can afford the advice. The average person cannot afford the type of tax planning advice that is being used in these sophisticated transactions by high income and wealthy taxpayers, whether they be corporate or individual. Somebody has to pay the tax. We can all agree on whether or not the tax that is raised is the correct amount and that spending is correct or incorrect. But we can argue, we can disagree, but I think we're in a situation where the way the revenues are being raised are not fair for average taxpayers. And
Yeah.
I say in the preface, written the book from a working class perspective, and I mean that.
Yeah, and I mean, I commend you for your passion on that. And we could debate on,
Yeah, we
tax
debate the
advisors.
details, but yeah, we can
Yeah,
debate with that.
but I really liked your closing comments on, the hardworking people at the Department of Finance Tax Legislation Division. I think Canada is, you know, to have such talent like yourself that was there for years. Number one, it's a treasure, and we need more. And so, thank you. And Kerry,
Well, thank you
really
for
appreciate your
inviting me,
time.
Kim. Thank you very much, and for your listeners, I hope this has been worthwhile of your time.
I for the tax practitioners and people that are passionate about tax in our country, I certainly will. And again, I hope your book is going to end up on, being read and end up as a reference point for future. It's certainly going to end up on my shelf as well. So, Kerry, thanks
Well,
again.
thank you very much, Kim, and say so long. Thank you very much.